Let's begin. Our first panelist is Barry Draycott, who is the owner of Terra. Barry has been a thought leader in the natural and organic products world for as long as I can remember. For the past 15 years, he's been mentoring me to give me a better understanding of the products that are out there in the market today. Good evening, Barry. How are you?
I'm good, Mike. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to be brief. I'll just say a few things because most of you know me, but I've been in the landscape industry since the early 80s and, went through the complete traditional method of, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Somewhere along the line, somebody started talking to me about microbiology in the soils, and, I thought he was out of his freaking mind, but, things just lined up for me, and I met more people and everything, and I was truly astounded how important natural soil is with all the life that's in there and the carbon, and how having healthy soil as far as the microbiology just helps so much having a healthy plant. And so again, I'll just shut up, but it's come a long way since when I first started out to now. We're at the point where, well, here in New Jersey, our New Jersey Landscape Contractors Association now has this out. So it's become mainstream rather than a bunch of hippie wackos. That's all I've got to say. Thanks.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I do remember when I first met you 20 years ago, you were a hippie wacko, and slowly you broke me down until I started to listen to what you had to say. And now it's come full cycle for me, where now that I joined the team. What drew you to Regenerative Turf System by Branch Creek? What made you be interested in it?
Well, the philosophy is very much what I've been following for years. When we started out at Terra, it was Terra Organics, and the goal was to be 100% organic. And over the years, it just didn't really work out that way in reality. You have to meet your clients' expectations, and there aren't organic products that will take care of anything. So we've kind of morphed into where we're, still using pesticides that are a low toxicity or minimum risk, but the fertilizers are pretty much organic based. So, it's been a change in philosophies based on business interest. To be frank, you have to keep your clients happy, and if you can do that 90% with natural products, that's a huge gain. And 10% you use products that you need to do to keep those clients on board. Interesting. You and I have talked about this for years, so I knew actually what the answer was going to be before I even asked it. So thanks, Barry. I appreciate that. Next, let me introduce you to Nate Clemmer. He is the CEO of Branch Creek Organics. Good evening, Nate.
Hey, Mike. How you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for asking. So I guess my question to you is, what started you on this path to regenerative turf? What was your aha moment?
So my aha moment was my wife and I built a house along a creek, and it took me, the first year of trying to get a lawn to grow in my backyard, that I realized that whatever goes in the soil behind my house is going in the creek. So, being in the chemical fertilizer business, distributing pesticides, selling chloride-based deicers, that was sort of the aha moment, that whatever goes in the soil is going in the water. And this is now probably 5 years ago. And that aha moment is sort of what kicked off a bunch of different things, including our Branch Creek company and our regenerative turf system. So that was the aha moment.
Nice. So I guess tonight you're going to basically give us a jump start. We're not going to be able to digest the whole regenerative turf system tonight, but you're going to give us some information that backs it up.
Yeah, I'm going to go for it'll probably be 10 to 15 minutes, just kind of give an introduction to the thought process and And then, obviously there's 3 weeks to follow here. And as Barry said, the regenerative turf system sets up with a lot of the principles that Barry's been following. So, some of the things that folks are going to hear tonight and over the next couple of weeks, I don't think are necessarily revolutionary, but I think as much as anything, we're trying to put language and understanding to maybe a frame to things that are already happening. It's somewhat a framework. So, but yeah, as Barry mentioned, our goal is to meet clients' expectations, but do it in a way that protects our planet as well as people and pets and all the other things that are important. So just trying to find that balance is really where we're at with the regenerative turf system. But I'm going to run through a couple things here. I'm in Minnesota right now because, as I mentioned, what goes in our soil goes in our water. Salt, chloride pollution is becoming a big problem. It's a really big problem in Minnesota. They got their first real snow of the year. So I'm here working with some customers in my hotel room here tonight. But so, basically my origin when it comes to chemical-based fertilizer goes back not really to 1869, but we had a family business called Moyer and Son that was started in 1869, and it was a feed mill. So farmers brought us crops, we milled their crops, stored their crops, and made animal feed. And then I would say about 50 years ago, this idea of chemical fertilizer became a thing, and the chemical companies approached at that point my grandfather's generation and said, hey, why don't you make these fertilizers? You already got the farm customers, you'll help them grow more crops, which means you'll have more grain to store and more animals to feed. And so we'll just make the circle bigger. And so that seemed like a good idea to them. Obviously, we didn't know then as many things as we know now. But as soon as there was such a thing as chemical fertilizer, my family was in the business of making it in Pennsylvania, to the point where about 30 years ago, that same business was making fertilizers. A lot of the farms were leaving the Philadelphia area. So they started a lawn care company called Moyer and Son. Moyer Indoor Outdoor is what it's called now. It's still in business. Large privately owned lawn care company that my family's no longer involved with. But this is me 30 years ago as a kid. I'm pretty sure I was the youngest ever licensed public applicator, certainly in the state of Pennsylvania, probably in the country. My parents thought, me going out and spraying lawns when I was 14 would be a good idea. And there was actually someone that drove me around and I got out and sprayed the lawns. And I think that also speaks to how far we've come, where 30 years ago we had a 14-year-old out spraying lawns, and now we're talking about, reducing, the amount of lawn care applications we're making, the toxicity and things of that nature. And I bring these things up to give some context of the perspective that we have, not just because of the history, but also our Cinetech brand is one of the largest manufacturers and distributors of chemical-based fertilizers and pesticides. And so I tell people all the time, I'm like the pot that calls himself black. And that means I'm not anti-pesticide, I'm not anti-chemical fertilizer, but I am very much pro solutions, very much pro better ways of thinking and realizing that things change over time. We know more now than we knew over the last 30 years, and we need to make changes. So I don't want to come across as someone who's waving fingers and saying we're doing things wrong. We do need to make changes though. So that's the background, that's the history. And so, it really, I think, helps me to have, good familiarity with where we've been, but also more importantly, where we're going. And so I think, we need to start with framing the problem of turf and the impacts that it has on our environment. And, one of the terms that I use is urbanized soil. So pretty much every lawn or golf course or sports field that we would work on is urbanized soil. It's non-native. It's been displaced. The topsoil gets removed. If we're lucky, a little bit comes back. But generally speaking, we're starting in a deficit position. So the lawn care industry is asked to come in to make lawns look good with soil that's really garbage. So that we're starting from behind the 8 ball, if you will. And so we're talking about soil that really looks like this. We talk about urbanized soil. It's heavily compacted. There's very little soil organic matter. And there's just lots of issues with it. And when it rains, we have lots of runoff. We literally have rivers in our lawns that run into the rivers actual rivers, and we have flooding issues and erosion issues, and we hear about these things. But then, if we get a couple weeks of hot, dry weather, despite how much rain we get, we then all of a sudden have these dead lawns, and it's like, well, how does this make any sense? We have all this rain, and now a couple weeks later, it gets hot and dry, and we have dead grass. And the reason is our soil isn't holding any water. It's urbanized. It's it looks like this. And so, when you have lawns that look like this, what do we do? Because when you have soil that looks like this, what do we do? Because people want lawns that look attractive. Well, we feed it a lot of chemical fertilizer. It's really the only way you can get grass to grow effectively when you have soil that looks like this. So we feed it a lot of chemical-based fertilizer. And so this is a Northeast statistic. Obviously, there's people on this call from all over the United States. And we don't have as much information for the rest of the country, but these figures in cool season turf seem pretty consistent. In warm season turf, they're higher, but roughly 4 pounds of chemical nitrogen per year per 1,000 square feet is what we're seeing be applied in what I'll call traditional, conventional lawn care programs. And there's a lot of programs out there that will say organic based or organic enhanced. I think that word organic is often used as like don't look over here kind of language, because I'm running more of a traditional program. So, I wouldn't, just because someone's saying they have an organic enhanced or organic based program, doesn't mean they're still not putting out a high level of chemical nitrogen. And so, some chemical nitrogen isn't a problem. Again, we're not anti chemical fertilizers, but, quite honestly, we use too much. And so we've got issues with harmful algae blooms in lakes, particularly in New York. We see this in New Jersey. It pops up in Wisconsin, Minnesota. We've got issues with red tide in the Gulf of Mexico. These things aren't all related to nutrient runoff that creates these algae blooms, but it's certainly a contributing factor, certainly a factor within our control. And so we got to be mindful of it. But here we go again, when we want lawns that look like this, and we have soil that looks like this, what are you supposed to do? And our only recourse really historically has been chemical-based fertilizers. And, to kind of double down on the issue, when our soil looks like this, we have a lot of weeds. We've got a lot of insect pressure, disease. And so we apply a lot of chemical-based pesticides in addition to the chemical-based fertilizers. And, some of these pesticides are a problem. They're highly toxic, and we need to be mindful of what's being used. But we find that the word pesticide sort of, in my opinion, I'll speak for myself, is unfairly demonized. Just because someone says the word pesticide doesn't instantly mean skull and crossbones. The EPA's definition of pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances intended for destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pests. You can read the whole definition. This is the definition of a pesticide. And so, when you keep that definition in mind, it really doesn't speak to toxicity. It speaks to controlling pests. So just to use the practical example, salt on my fries is delicious. But if I'm going to create a slug control that's based upon sodium chloride salt, and I sell it as a slug control, that same salt that I put on my French fries and is delicious is now a pesticide by definition of what a pesticide is. So please don't hear me trying to suggest that pesticides aren't a problem. There are many that are, but there's also very many pesticides that have extremely low use rates and are extremely low toxicity levels. And too often we're like, no, can't use that. And then the fear becomes, we have lawns that end up looking like garbage, and people go back to the old way, the really old way. Lots of chemical fertilizers, lots of chemical pesticides. So I think, we got to be careful about how we use the word pesticide. And so, but it's a tricky one. And, the lawn care industry is not regulated. So, and we've got a lot of shady players, people that like to use spin and hyperbole and trickery. And, you probably have names of competitors that come to mind as I say that. And so language is important. And if we don't find higher ground, if we don't have a way to create a standardization, those shadier players are gonna kind of dance on the parade, or dance on the grave of what we're trying to do as an industry. And so one of the presentation topics, I think it's next week actually, will be with Cornell University, and they'll be talking about their environmental impact quotient. And so I'm not going to talk about this very much, but basically Cornell came up with a way of evaluating toxicity by each pesticide, and it's a score. It's a model, and so it's subject to variables and assumptions. So because of that, it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And when you hear more about it, I think you'll agree with me that it's really the best thing out there for a fairly and impartially determining, what is a toxic pesticide and what is something that, when used responsibly, is something that we really shouldn't be afraid of when it relates to people, pets, and the planet. So the environmental impact quotient is a big part of a regenerative turf system. So, and just to kind of give a little bit more context to numbers, a typical Northeast lawn care program, again, I think you could extend this to all cool season turf, has an EIQ score of about 90, which is pretty high. In a regenerative turf system, we'd like to see that number be, less than 10. So significantly less use of significantly lower score of the EIQ in a regenerative turf system compared to what we see out there now. And so when we think of pesticides, we've got sort of the obvious, immediate, in our face concerns of kids, pets, and the exposure to things like insecticides and, kids, all toxicity is a function of size of the person or animal and the amount of exposure. So the smaller person, pet, the more likely that there's going to be an issue related to pesticide exposure. So there's a short-term concern. There's also the more longer-term, less connected concerns of fish kills, bee populations, turtles, pesticides getting into our groundwater. All the water we have today is all we're ever going to have, so we got to make sure we don't pollute it. These are all concerns related to pesticides. But once again, when our soil looks like this, and we want grass that looks like this, we often go back to ways of doing things that are highly dependent on chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And we got this other issue that isn't going away, related to the amount of carbon in our atmosphere. And there's more and more work being done and more data being gathered that talks about how we can, by how we manage our soils. Agricultural soils is where most of the research has been, how we can, put carbon back into the soil. The reality is there's just as much carbon on the planet today as there was 1,000 years ago. What's changed is more of it's in the atmosphere versus in the ground where it came from. So figuring out how we can, manage soil, agricultural soils, turf soils differently can be a part of changing the course of climate. And so that's a really important part of what we're focused on with the regenerative turf system. But overall, this path that we're on, when we talk about, the flooding, and we talk about the flooding followed by drought, and we talk about pesticide runoff and chemical fertilizer runoff, it's a degenerative model. And I think as a society, we feel this sense of degeneration even before COVID. You turn on the news, it's forest fires, it's floods, it's hurricanes. I mean, it's just, there's this sense of like, we're just degenerating this planet. And, we in lawn care industry turn to this language of organic as sort of higher ground, as a way to move away from chemical-based approaches to doing everything. And as Barry mentioned earlier, it's a challenge to grow turf, to grow grass that meets customers' expectations when we're following a truly certified organic approach. I mean, the reality is the certified organic standard was designed for food crops, and we're very familiar with it. We do work in organic agriculture. This is a great standard. It makes a ton of sense, but it was never designed for turf. And so we try as an industry to take the whole thing, the entire certified organic standard, and overlay it, but it just doesn't fit. So what do? We take pieces of it, and it sort of becomes, not what it was originally intended. And so, if you're going to grow urbanized soil to a complete, truly certified organic standard, you're going to have a disaster of a yard pretty quick. And so we got to think about, what does this language look like? And, when we talk about organic lawn care, if this was an in-person event, we could have dialogue back and forth. If I asked the question of the group, what is the definition of organic lawn care? We could let it go for 15 minutes. But the reality is every answer would be wrong because there is no definition for organic lawn care. Or maybe I should say that every answer would be right because there is no definition of organic lawn care. And so that word, that phrase, organic lawn care, I think has sort of been hijacked. And because we talk about language being important, in some ways, it's hard to use this language anymore. And so when we thought about like, okay, what goes in our soil goes in our water, how do we create lawns that people are going to be proud of, but we do it in a way that is going to significantly reduce the amount of chemical fertilizers, going to significantly reduce the toxicity of the pesticides we're using. We struggled for a couple of years because it felt like we were, with the organic language, we're just trying to jam this square peg in this round hole. And we just, we couldn't figure it out. And then I started doing some work with two organizations, in particular, Rodale Institute and Kiss the Ground, through their soil advocate training. And it really, both organizations were talking about this regenerative way of thinking about soil. They were talking about it in the context of agriculture, but I started thinking like, well, this language, this approach really fits for turf for a variety of reasons. We won't go into all of them today. And so once that, once that window opened, everything just started to flow. And so it's like, yeah, you know what? We need to stop thinking about organic and start thinking regenerative. So we're not anti-pesticide, but we're anti lots of pesticides, high levels of toxicity. We're not anti-chemical fertilizer, but we're looking to reduce significantly the amount that's being used. And so this is really, when we think about a regenerative model, we're trying to take urbanized soil that looks like what's on the left, and move it towards soil which is on the right. And that's ultimately our goal. And I think one of the quotes that really fits what we're doing here, or trying to do, is from Albert Einstein, and says we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And I think this is really true. I think it's true for this problem, but it's true for every problem that we come across. Is we can't just, like, if we went 30 years down the wrong path, we can't just turn around and go back where we started and then just go down a different trail. It's like, no, we're already 30 years down this path. We've got to recognize where we're at, recognize the problem, but also appreciate the opportunity, and then go from there. And so that's what we're really trying to do with the regenerative turf system. We think it thinks differently than what we've done in the past. And we really believe that it's a platform, and the language is a platform that we can move forward with as an industry, to give our customers what they're really looking for, protect our planet, and also give lawn care operators an opportunity to earn an income, earn a living, and do it in a way that has integrity. So like Barry talked about the soil, it really does come back to the soil. And this isn't necessarily new information, but when we focus on the soil, healthy soil, it needs less pesticides. We're not saying it doesn't need any pesticides, but it needs less pesticides. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we'll evaluate the health of the soil, and based upon the health of the soil, we'll determine how much pesticide it needs. Sort of like we're going to meet the soil where it's at in terms of how much pesticide it's going to get. So highly urbanized soil, new housing community, the soil is just a disaster. It's going to get more pesticide than a soil that's been in a regenerative turf system for 10 years. Maybe that uses no chemical-based pesticides. Healthy soil needs less chemical fertilizer. Again, not saying it doesn't need any chemical fertilizer. Same issue, new housing community, highly urbanized soil, really poor soil, poor growing conditions. It's going to use more chemical fertilizer than a lawn that's been in a regenerative turf system for 10 years. Healthy soil is going to hold more water. We got an issue with flooding in this country, and we believe that if we can change the way people manage their lawns, golf courses, sports fields, we can put an impact on that. And we're going to put carbon back where it came from. So by proper growing, different growing practices, we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back in the ground. Now, obviously, we're talking about 1,000 square feet at a time. We're not talking about thousands of acres at a time. So these are drops in the ocean, but they're steps that we can take. Every one of us can take to help change the course of climate. And we believe that's a really key part of our regenerative turf system. We'll talk more about that here over the next couple of weeks. And most importantly, healthy soil produces great looking turf. The best golf course superintendents that I know that we work with, they describe themselves as soil managers. If they can get the soil to be where it needs to be, then everything else kind of takes care of itself. And so all these things kind of put into a bowl and blended together is really what led us to our regenerative turf system. And that word system is really important. It's not a program, it's a system. You can't just pull things out and expect that everything's going to work. Everything sort of builds on each other. The best way I can describe it is sort of like if you get like 7 or 8 logs and you lean them together properly, they can all stay in one place. But if one log's heavier, if one log's missing, the whole thing falls down. That's what a regenerative turf system is. And so all these pieces working together is what a regenerative turf system is. And we'll get more into that here over the next couple of weeks.